I never imagined that a simple disagreement with my HOA Karen neighbor would escalate to this level. When she called 911 on my farm, I was ready for her to pull one of her usual power moves. But what she didn't know was that I had something much stronger up my sleeve. The moment I showed my badge and a warrant for her arrest, her jaw hit the floor. This is the story of how one woman's misuse of authority led to her downfall in the most unexpected way. The morning was bright and crisp as the first light of the day slowly crept over the hills. The air was fresh with a slight chill, a perfect reflection of early autumn on the farm. A soft breeze ruffled the golden leaves hanging from the old oak trees surrounding the house, and the sun's rays bathed the entire landscape in a warm, amber hue. The sky above was an endless canvas of blue, with only a few clouds scattered lazily across it. The tranquility of the morning was something I had come to cherish. This was my sanctuary, my escape from the noise and hustle of the outside world. For me, this farm wasn't just land. It was a place of peace, a haven where I could reconnect with nature and live life on my own terms. Inside the farmhouse, I was finishing my breakfast. The clinking of the fork against the plate sounded far too loud in the quiet kitchen, but it was a sound I was used to, the rhythm of my day. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, curling around the warm aroma of scrambled eggs and toast. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the chickens pecking at the dirt, their feathers glinting in the morning light. The cows, fat and content, slowly moved about in the pasture, grazing lazily under the watchful eyes of the barn. Even the goats, with their playful bleats, were carrying on their morning routine, scrambling over the rock piles in their pen as though each new day presented a new adventure. It was moments like this that I treasured most, when everything was calm, predictable, and in its place. It was my life, and it felt right. Just as I took my last bite, there was a knock at the door. It was sharp, quick, and unexpected. I set my fork down, wiping my mouth with the napkin as I stood up. For a moment, I thought maybe it was one of the neighbors needing help with something trivial, like a loan of a tool or a request to borrow a cup of sugar. But as I walked to the door, I felt a tightening in my chest, a subtle unease creeping in. I couldn't explain it, but something about the knock, the suddenness of it, felt off. I opened the door, and there she stood, Karen. At first glance, it was the usual. She was tall, dressed in dark sunglasses, with a stern expression painted across her perfectly made-up face. Her attire was immaculate. She wore a tailored coat, sharp black pants, and the kind of boots that screamed designer label. She had an aura of self-importance about her, like she owned the world around her. It was no surprise. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her reputation. She lived just a few acres over, and she was notorious for making life difficult for those around her. No one had ever been able to pinpoint the exact reason why she did it, but it was clear that Karen enjoyed wielding whatever power she had, no matter how small. Whether it was through her HOA position or just her ability to make everyone uncomfortable with her demands, Karen knew how to make people squirm. "Can I help you, Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I had no interest in getting into one of her complaints today. I had already dealt with enough of those over the years. I wasn't in the mood for one more of her demands, especially not today, when everything was so perfect. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice low and authoritative as though she were in charge. She took a step closer to me, and I immediately felt my instincts go on alert. She had that look in her eyes, the kind of look that said she wasn't here to discuss, but to command. "About what?" I asked, my suspicion rising. I wasn't in the mood for another one of her rants about how my farm was ruining the peace of the neighborhood. It was always the same thing. If it wasn't the noise, it was the animals. If it wasn't the animals, it was the barn. There was always something about my life on the farm that didn't sit right with her. something she could nitpick and use as leverage to make my life miserable. I didn't know how much longer I could endure her constant harassing. "I've had enough of this farm," Karen said, and for the first time, her voice was sharper than usual, colder. Her eyes narrowed, and the tightness in her jaw made it clear she was serious. "The animals are disturbing the peace. They're too loud. And I'm filing a formal complaint against you with the HOA. You're violating zoning laws, and I won't stand by and let it continue." I raised an eyebrow in disbelief. This wasn't the first time Karen had tried to make my life difficult. She had done it before, each time coming up with a new complaint, but none of them had ever held any water. I had always been in compliance with the zoning laws, and I kept the farm in perfect condition, ensuring that I didn't disturb the neighborhood. But Karen? She didn't see it that way. She didn't see anything except her own vision of what the world should be. "Zoning laws?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though I could feel my patience thinning. "Karen, my farm is well within the regulations, you know that," she scoffed, the sound echoing in the quiet of the morning. "You've been flaunting those laws for years. Just because you've gotten away with it doesn't mean it's right. The peace of the neighborhood is being disturbed, and I'm done with it." Her eyes burned with a self-righteous anger. She had convinced herself that she was in the right, and nothing I said would change that. "I've already called 911, she continued, her words dropping like stones into the pit of my stomach. "I've reported you for noise violations, harassment, and improper animal management. They'll be here soon." The shock of hearing her mention 911 caught me off guard. My initial thought was disbelief. I had no idea she would escalate things this far. For years, Karen had tried to leverage the HOA board to get what she wanted, to impose her will on anyone she deemed undesirable. But this was next level. Calling 911 over a farm's routine? It didn't make any sense, and yet here we were. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface now began to bubble up, but I forced myself to stay calm. Karen was just trying to provoke me into reacting, trying to get me to make a mistake so she could say I was the one out of control. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "Karen, you're wasting everyone's time. The authorities aren't going to come for something as trivial as this." Karen didn't back down. Her gaze remained cold and unflinching, and her expression was full of confidence, as if she knew she held all the cards. "We'll see about that," she replied, a dangerous edge in her voice. "You'll regret this. I'm going to make sure of it." With a sharp turn, Karen pivoted on her heel and walked away without another word, her boots clicking sharply on the ground with every step. I watched her retreating form, already preparing for what was coming next. I knew she wouldn't. Stop here. This wasn't just about a complaint, it was about control. And as she disappeared from view, I could already hear the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. The storm was coming, and it was one I had no choice but to face head-on. It wasn't long before the faint wail of sirens grew louder and clearer. The unmistakable sound of police vehicles on their way, signaling that Karen had indeed followed through on her threat. As I walked outside to meet the officers, my mind raced. Karen had made it clear that this was more than just a nuisance complaint. This was a personal attack. This wasn't about zoning laws, noise violations, or any of the other fabricated complaints she had thrown my way over the years. It was about her need for control, her desire to make my life as difficult as possible. She had taken it too far. This time, and I was about to find out just how far she was willing to push it. The two squad cars rolled up the long gravel driveway, their flashing lights casting an eerie red-blue glow across the farm's expansive landscape. It seemed surreal, almost out of place against the peaceful backdrop of the farm where the cows grazed lazily and the chickens clucked away in their pen. I had dealt with petty disputes with neighbors in the past, complaints about my animals, or the occasional noise. But this felt different. Karen had called 911 on me, and I had no idea how this would play out. I took a deep breath as I stood at the edge of the driveway, waiting for the officers to approach. It wasn't the first time the police had been called to my property. In fact, there had been a handful of minor calls, usually stemming from Karen's complaints. But the officers would come, they'd ask a few questions, check the farm, and ultimately, nothing would come of it. But today was different. I had a sinking feeling that this time, things would escalate. The first officer stepped out of the car. A young woman with dark hair, her uniform sharply pressed. She exuded the kind of confidence you'd expect from someone who had recently completed their training. The stern look on her face told me she wasn't here to engage in any friendly conversation. Her eyes scanned the farm, taking in the sprawling fields, the barn off to the side, and the distant clucks of chickens. She had the demeanor of someone who had seen it all, but I could sense she was still sizing up the situation. "Are you the owner of this property?" she asked, her voice steady, but with a hint of skepticism. I nodded, trying to remain composed. "I am. How can I help you?" "We've received a noise complaint," she said, not looking at me but continuing to survey the surroundings. "We were told that you're violating zoning laws and disturbing the peace." The frustration surged in my chest. This was exactly what Karen had wanted, to waste my time, to disrupt my life. I kept my voice as calm as possible, despite the anger boiling inside me. "That's absurd. My animals are well within the zoning laws, and the noise level is within acceptable limits. Karen, the woman who called you," I gestured toward her house in the distance, "has been trying to cause trouble for me for months." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. She was clearly trying to process the information, perhaps weighing my words against the complaint she had received. After a few moments of silence, she finally turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Is that so?" I nodded firmly, my frustration starting to show in my posture. "Yes, this isn't the first time she's called on me. She doesn't like the fact that I live here and runs to the HOA every chance she gets to complain about my farm. But there's nothing illegal about what I'm doing. I've been following all the regulations. Everything is in compliance." The officer's gaze softened for a brief second, but then she seemed to snap back to her professional demeanor. "We'll need to inspect the property to verify the complaint," she said, though I could tell she still wasn't entirely convinced. "Do you have any objections?" "No, go ahead," I said, my voice now tinged with a hint of annoyance. I motioned toward the open fields and the barn just beyond. "You'll find everything in order. You'll find no violations." The officer nodded, not saying another word as she turned to head in the direction of the barn. I watched her walk toward the barn, her boots crunching against the gravel as she went. The other officers remained in their vehicles, likely waiting for instructions or observing the situation from a distance. I stood there, rooted to the spot for a few seconds, watching the officer as she walked. There was a sinking feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. This whole situation felt off, like I was being dragged into something far more complicated than a simple complaint. Karen's involvement had escalated everything. This wasn't about noise or zoning laws anymore. This was about power, and I wasn't going to let her have it. I turned back to my house and entered, making my way to the desk where I kept important paperwork. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as I grabbed my badge and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I had been a law enforcement officer for years before I moved to the farm. I had kept my certification up to date, though I hadn't used it in a while. I wasn't an active officer anymore, but I was still trained, and that training gave me a unique position, one that I wasn't going to waste. Karen's move to involve the police was not just a petty grievance anymore. It was a deliberate attempt to disrupt my life, to manipulate the situation so she could have her way. I had dealt with enough of her antics to know when something was off. She wasn't just trying to ruin my day. She was trying to destroy everything I had worked for, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I walked back outside, the cool air hitting my face as I stepped onto the porch. The officer was still inspecting the barn, but I didn't know how long she would be there. Time was ticking, and Karen's game was in motion. I needed to act fast, or else I risked being painted as the villain in this situation, just as Karen had hoped. I made my way toward the officer, the badge hidden under the folds of my jacket. As I approached her, I could see that she was examining the barn, looking at the animals and the space with a careful eye. She hadn't even noticed me approach until I was only a few feet away. "Officer," I said, my voice calm but firm. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable as I stepped into view. "There's something you need to know." The officer's eyes flickered to the badge under my jacket. Her stance tightened, and she immediately straightened up. The change was subtle, but it was there. The professional distance between us grew as she realized who she was dealing with. "What's this?" she asked, her voice now more cautious. I pulled the badge from under my jacket and held it out for her to see. "I'm an officer of the law," I said, keeping my tone even, "and I'm the one who should be investigating this complaint, not you." The officer stared at me for a moment, her mouth slightly agape, before her expression shifted into something more respectful, but still guarded. "I wasn't aware." "You didn't mention it earlier," she said, a hint of confusion in her voice. "I didn't think it was necessary," I said. "But now it is. I know what Karen's doing. She's not here because of zoning violations or noise complaints. She's here because she's been trying to bully me for months. She uses her position to try to force me out of this community, and she's done it to others too. But I've had enough." The officer nodded slowly, her expression softening a little. "I see. So, what do you want us to do?" I looked her in the eye. "I want you to understand that this is bigger than a simple zoning issue. If Karen wants to escalate this, then I'll be forced to take action. I have evidence of her harassment, and if she's willing to waste your time, then I'll be ready to hold her accountable." There was a long pause as the officer processed my words. I could tell she wasn't used to this. Most of the time, people would simply comply, avoid confrontation, and let the officers handle the situation. But Karen had chosen the wrong person to push. She had underestimated me, and now I was going to turn the tables. "All right," the officer said, nodding. Slowly. "Let's take a look at the situation. But if what you say is true, and Karen is making false claims, we'll be sure to address that with her as well." The crisp afternoon air brushed against my skin as I walked back out onto the porch, my badge now in hand. The weight of it felt strangely empowering, as if I had just crossed a threshold, ready to take control of the situation that had spiraled out of control far too many times. My boots crunched against the gravel as I moved toward the two figures standing by the barn. The officer was still talking with Karen, though she was doing more of the talking. She was too busy outlining her fabricated complaints to even notice my approach. But when I stepped into their line of sight, I saw the subtle shift in Karen's posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, and the sudden pause in her words as she turned to face me. I could already feel the power dynamic changing, and it was almost as if I could see the realization dawn on her that she had miscalculated. Karen was standing just a few feet away from the officer, her face wearing that trademark smug expression that had become all too familiar. The superiority in her stance made it clear she was convinced that her complaints, however baseless, would be enough to push me out of the neighborhood once and for all. But today, as she met my gaze, there was a crack in her facade. The look on her face was one of confusion, then shock. It was clear she hadn't expected the turn of events that had unfolded. I stopped a few paces away, feeling the cool breeze tug at my jacket, the badge in my hand catching the light. "Officer," I said, my voice firm and clear, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." The officer turned toward me, but I didn't miss Karen's reaction. Her eyes darted between the officer and me, her face showing the faintest flicker of uncertainty. It was a momentary crack in her armor, and it felt like a victory in itself. She hadn't yet realized that the tables had shifted, but I could already see the seeds of doubt planting themselves in her mind. It wasn't just a question of power anymore. It was a matter of truth, and she was quickly losing the battle. Wait. You're a cop? Karen stammered, her voice filled with an undercurrent of disbelief. I smiled inwardly. The power shift, so palpable it was almost tangible. I am, I said calmly, allowing the weight of my words to settle in. And it seems like you've made a very serious mistake, Karen. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. She had come here with a clear objective, to force me out of my own home, to take control of a situation that she believed was hers to dictate. She thought her position in the HOA gave her the authority to do whatever she wanted, but now, as she stood before me, her world was unraveling in front of her. The very power she had so recklessly wielded was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I don't know what you're talking about, Karen stammered, trying to gather herself, but it was clear her confidence was faltering. This farm is violating zoning laws, and I stepped forward, cutting her off mid-sentence. You're wasting the officer's time, I said, my voice even and authoritative. I could feel the shift in the air as I pulled out a warrant from the inside of my jacket and held it up for her to see. The thin, crinkled paper felt almost heavy in my hand, a symbol of everything Karen had done wrong. The words on it were simple, but they carried weight. Actually, Karen, it's you who's in violation of the law. I've been investigating you for some time now, and I have a warrant for your arrest. Her expression froze, and for a moment she couldn't even speak. Her mouth hung open, but no words came out. It was a brief moment, but in it I saw the full realization of her situation. For all her bluster, all the power she had assumed, she held over me and the community. It all came crashing down in an instant. She had crossed a line, and now she had nowhere to go but down. What? What are you talking about? Arrest? For what? Her voice rose in panic, high-pitched and frantic. For a brief moment, it sounded almost childlike, a far cry from the woman who had strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it. For harassment, misuse of authority, and filing false reports, I replied calmly, my voice controlled. Each word carried its own weight, and I could see her processing them, trying to piece together what had just happened. Her face flushed red, but there was no more arrogance in her eyes, only fear. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. She was trying to make sense of it all, but the truth was too much for her to handle. She couldn't fathom that the person she had tried to push around, the person she had threatened and bullied for months, was the very person who had the power to stop her. You've been using your position in the HOA to make false complaints, harass your neighbors, and intimidate others into doing what you want, I said, watching her eyes widen as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. I've been building a case against you for months, Karen. You won't get away with it anymore. The officer standing beside me, who had been silent up until now, shifted slightly, her eyes flickering between Karen and me as the situation unfolded. It was clear she was processing the information just as much as Karen was. The realization that Karen wasn't the upstanding citizen she had presented herself to be was slowly dawning on her. Karen's eyes shifted nervously, looking to the officer for help, but there was none to be found. The officer stood there, arms crossed, now fully aware of the situation. It was clear that Karen's bluff had been called, and there was nothing she could do to reverse it. You can't do this, Karen sputtered, the panic rising in her voice. I'm just trying to protect the community. Her hands trembled at her sides as she tried to gather herself, but the words were weak, filled with desperation. I shook, my head slowly. No, Karen. You're trying to control the community for your own benefit, and now you'll be held accountable. The officer, now fully understanding the gravity of the situation, stepped forward. Karen, we're going to have to place you under arrest, she said, her voice firm. The words hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Her entire body seemed to stiffen, the last vestiges of her defiance fading away. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was frozen, her face a mixture of disbelief and rage. But no matter how much she wanted to fight back, she couldn't escape the reality of the situation. She had pushed too far, and now the consequences were staring her in the face. The officer moved toward Karen and, with a swift motion, placed the handcuffs on her wrists. Karen didn't resist, though the fury in her eyes was palpable. She was no longer the powerful figure who had marched into my life demanding things. Now, she was just another person, facing the consequences of their actions. I watched as the officer led Karen toward the squad car, her steps heavy and reluctant. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. The powerful woman who had used her influence to terrorize the community was now being escorted away, her fate no longer in her hands. She was the one being led away in cuffs, her power stripped, away in an instant. As Karen was placed into the back of the squad car, I turned to the officer beside me. "Thank you for handling this professionally," I said, my voice calm but filled with a quiet satisfaction. "I'm glad we could clear everything up." The officer nodded, her expression still one of surprise but also respect. "I had no idea," she said, glancing back toward the squad car where Karen was now seated. "We'll take it from here. You've done your part." I watched as the car pulled away, the red and blue lights flashing in the distance as it made its way down the long driveway. The farm, once a place of tension and uncertainty, now felt peaceful again. Karen's presence had been like a storm cloud hanging over everything, but now that cloud had passed. I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. This wasn't just about a neighbor's complaint. It was about standing up to someone who had been abusing their power, someone who thought they could control others for their own benefit. And in the end, I had won. The peace that settled over the farm was unlike anything I had felt in a long time. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a warm, golden light across the land. The cows were back to grazing, the chickens clucked happily, and the soft breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. It was the quiet after the storm, and for the first time in months, I could breathe freely again. The days that followed Karen's arrest were nothing short of surreal. The farm, which had once been a battleground, a place where every day felt like a struggle against her constant interference, was now quiet. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I woke up to a peaceful morning, free of the anxiety and tension that Karen had cast over my life. The chickens clucked contentedly in the yard, the cows ambled lazily across the pasture, and the goats, once confined to their pens for fear of her incessant complaints, now roamed freely with a certain ease that mirrored my own. The phone calls from the HOA had ceased, the barrage of emails and letters that once flooded my inbox had stopped, and for the first time in months, I could hear myself think. It was almost as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but at the same time, a part of me couldn't quite believe it. It felt like a dream, like everything I had fought for was finally starting to fall into place. Karen's arrest had been the catalyst for her downfall, and as much as I had dreaded the conflict, the confrontation, it had ultimately been the right thing to do. I had taken a stand, not just for myself, but for anyone who had been affected by her overreach and her relentless need to control the lives of those around her. The community was beginning to breathe again, free from the shadow of Karen's abuse of power. As the days went on, the quiet returned to the neighborhood, but it wasn't just the absence of Karen that made things peaceful. It was the growing sense that justice had been done, that someone had finally stood up to her. And to my surprise, people began to come forward. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out, too intimidated by Karen's power and influence. They started sharing their stories, revealing the countless ways she had tried to manipulate and control them. how she had used her position in the HOA to bully others into submission. Some had been hesitant to speak before, afraid of the consequences, but now, with Karen facing charges, they felt empowered to tell their side of the story. One by one, neighbors I had barely spoken to came up to me, their expressions a mix of gratitude and awe. "Thank you," they said, their voices filled with sincerity. "We've been living in fear of her for years. No one dared to stand up to her, but you did what no one else could. You took her down." It wasn't about personal glory, for me though. It wasn't about receiving thanks or recognition. It was about doing the right thing. I had used my background in law enforcement and my position to expose the truth, to bring down someone who had abused her power for far too long. What Karen had done wasn't just about petty neighborhood disputes. It was about control. It was about using her influence to make others feel powerless. And I had fought back, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been made to feel small because of her. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Meanwhile, Karen's life was unraveling in ways I couldn't have predicted. Charges against her were serious. Fraud, harassment, misuse of power, and false reports, each one a reflection of the countless ways she had wronged people. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the fact that she had been caught in a lie, exposed for who she truly was. The community, once afraid of her, now saw her for what she was, a manipulative bully with no regard for the rules or the well-being of those around her. The whispers started almost immediately. I heard through the grapevine that Karen was being kicked off the HOA board, and that the once silent members of the community were starting to distance themselves from her. Her reputation had been shattered, and there was no coming back from it. For someone who had once held so much power, who had once walked into a room with the belief that she could control everything, the fall from grace was swift, unforgiving, and absolute. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had finally been held accountable for her actions. But even as I reflected on the outcome of it all, a part of me felt sadness for the way things had turned out. I didn't want to be the person who ruined someone's life. I didn't want to be the one to bring down the wrath of the community. But in the end, Karen had left me no choice. She had pushed too far, used her power too recklessly, and when people like her fail to realize the damage they're causing, someone has to step in and stop them. In this case, that someone was me. As the days turned into weeks, I watched as the farm transformed once again. The animals had always been my refuge, my connection to a simpler, quieter life. But now, they felt like symbols of my peace, symbols of the life I had worked so hard to build. The horses that once looked skittish and nervous around people seemed more relaxed, their coats gleaming in the sunlight as they trotted across the pasture. The chickens, once cooped up in their pens because of Karen's constant complaints, now roamed freely, scratching at the earth with contentment. And the barn, once the subject of so many criticisms, stood proudly in the distance, its weathered wood now a sign of endurance. I found myself spending more time out there, walking the fields, breathing in the fresh air, and appreciating the silence that had become so rare. I had always believed in the simplicity of farm life, in the peace that came with working the land, but now I understood it in a new light. The peace was more than just the absence of noise. It was the absence of conflict, the absence of fear. For the first time in a long time, I could feel myself truly relaxing again. One evening, as the sun began to set over the hills, casting the farm in a warm, golden light, I stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the cows graze. The world around me seemed to slow down, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity and peace. The fight had been long and hard, but I had won. And in the process, I had found something more important than just victory. I had found a renewed sense of purpose. I had done what was right, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been forced to live in the shadow of Karen's overreach. I had used my badge and position to bring justice, to fight back against someone who had thought she could control the world around her. And now, the community was free from her grip. The farm, once a symbol of tension, now stood as a testament to what could happen when people refused to back down, when they stood up for what was right. The phone rang in the distance, breaking the quiet of the evening. I didn't rush to answer it. It could wait. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to be constantly on alert, constantly watching over my shoulder. I was home, truly home, and it had never felt better. As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle overhead, I walked back to the house, feeling a sense of accomplishment that filled every corner of my being. The farm was peaceful again, and in this peace, I knew I had earned my place. The farm, my sanctuary, had never felt more like home. If you've enjoyed this story of justice and standing up against abuse, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Stay tuned for more episodes on the HOA stories.